the Rings never got me into fantasy. It was never the concept about escaping into another world. It was the world that was magical being right here. And with all the hell that's happening in our current world, it makes sense that the more popular stories are fantasies that take place in other worlds so we can leave our problem in the current world behind. But what if what the world needs right now is for that magic to come back on Earth? Today I'm sharing my reasons for why I believe urban fantasy deserves a comeback. Well, when I say comeback, I mean a very specific kind of comeback. I've read a lot of urban fantasy stories, both good and bad, and the ones that stick with me the most are the ones that follow the conventions that I'm about to list. But I need to quickly define what I'm talking about when it comes to urban fantasies. There is so much disparity in the genre that I even got mixed up in for a while. Most people consider urban fantasy to be a fantasy story set on Earth, but there's a bit more to it than that. Urban fantasy takes place in an urban environment, typically a city like New York, London, any old city. So there's some parts of the genre that I'm not always going to be touching on, such as paranormal romance, because that can take place in the city or in a small town. It's not specifically relating to the actual city, being a part of the magic and the surrounding fantasy worlds. And I'm not going to be discussing portal fantasies either, because that involves a relationship with this world and a world that the author has created. I did, however, discuss portal fantasies in this video up here. Go check out the histories on portal fantasies. Now, let's talk what I think needs to be in the urban fantasies of the future. A variety of creatures. Quite typically in an urban fantasy, or most stories set on Earth, you have a specific set of creatures that get rotated around that live in conjunction with humans. Creatures living amongst humans has been a staple of urban fantasies, especially in the early 90s and 2000s. There can be one type or there can be a lot of them, such as the Shadowhunter series having vampires, demons, and angels. I have for a long time been over the vampire and werewolf duopoly, which has been present in some urban fantasy stories. I have honestly preferred the portrayal of vampires in high fantasy, like in Curse of Strahd, the adventure for Dungeons & Dragons. No, I have not yet played Baldur's Gate 3, and no, Astarion is not going to be my character's boyfriend. But there have been some cases of vampires in urban fantasy that I've quite enjoyed, such as What We Do in the Shadows, where many different generations of vampires are all flatting together in the same house. Mythology continues to be a fun angle too that I love to see popping into urban fantasies. While I wasn't personally a fan of the book Vigil by Angela Slater, I did like the world building, especially where they had two different interpretations of sirens. The one from Greek mythology, where it is a flying bird woman, and the other one being the more common one today about the mermaid that uses song to lure sailors to their deaths. In Vigil, it ended up sort of being a big mythology hub that was centered in the city of Melbourne. I love seeing creatures that get sort of unrepresented in fantasy as a whole. Samantha Shannon's Bone Season series introduces ghosts and paranormal activity as the main sort of thing happening in different cities across Europe that the main character travels to. People will say that this is a dystopian fantasy, but because it takes place in cities, I also consider it an urban fantasy. I'm also a huge fan of original creatures. I love seeing what different minds can come up with. These different combinations of creatures make for such fascinating world building. How do these creatures interact with the city? What roles do they have, and what do they do to be able to hide within these cities? Having these creatures makes the relationship between the magical and the mundane that much more interesting, and it makes me learn a lot about the culture of a city. That is, until the convention becomes cliche. I think we've heard enough about demon crime bosses. City culture. Now we're talking about what makes a city a city. The urban culture. While the 2000s hype over vampires and demons living in the city and that being the main factor, being the creature in the city, there's been a lot more stories recently where the city or the area someone is living in ends up being more of a focal point and the magic weaves itself in. Legend Born by Tracy Dion does this expertly by centering it around a university campus in Carolina. It weaves Arthurian legend and African American folklore and history together to make a massive anti-slavery story. Such a deeply dark and grounded plotline in just the first book alone, and I can't wait to read the rest of the series. This is just one example of stories out there that become more than just placing something magical into a city. It is an intrinsic understanding of a city's urban culture or the history behind it, and working out ways to be able to weave the magic and the mundane together to create something fully fleshed out. Another recent example is Blood to Poison by Mary Watson. This is about a teen who's about to start university but has to use magic to break a curse on her and understand some generational trauma that was brought upon her by some witches in Cape Town. It's another urban fantasy that is deliciously rich with culture and from a city that you don't expect to see in urban fantasy. I love these kinds of stories because they simply cannot be picked up and moved into a different city and make everything make sense. It makes each story absolutely unique to the setting, and I think it's an edge that writers who grew up in cities have, that when they start writing an urban fantasy, they make it based around an experience in a city that they lived in for a long time. It enables them to weave story, magic, and location together in such masterful ways, making fantasy fun. Another thing I feel I need to mention in here is the tone of urban fantasies. Why are they always so dark, grim, and serious? Urban fantasy in its prime was notorious for being dark, gritty, and mature, with a lot of quotes around it. Today they're about as dark, gritty, and mature as a teen going through an emo phase. This comes with their choice in creatures such as the vampires and the demons, but also the content. More often than not, urban fantasy used to evolve around some kind of crime scene. Murders, detectives, lots of crime, and lots of sex. For no good reason for that sex part personally, and not just because I'm asexual. Can the creators not think of another way to bring fantasy creatures into the world than through crime? My favorite urban fantasies have much more fun or insightful ways to be able to bring creatures or the magical into the real world. The prime example, Rick Riordan. I never know how to pronounce his name. He doesn't just interlace Greek, Roman, and Egyptian mythology, just to name a few, into the world seamlessly. He makes it so wacky. He literally has the warriors of the Amazon run Amazon. Medusa runs a garden emporium. A Los Angeles record company is the gateway to the underworld. Who would have thought of that? That is brilliant. That is so genius. Rick Riordan simply has the guts to say, why not, when it comes to bringing fantasy creatures into his urban worlds. Many other storytellers should have the guts to do that too. It doesn't have to make sense straight away. That's what the world building and the editing is for, to make the magical insertion that you have make a lot more sense. Washing out the whitewashing. Urban fantasy is very white when it does not need to be. We already get enough critiques from non-fantasy stories where they have a cast full of nothing but white people or just a couple of people of color, when in a city, that is very rare. Hello friends. Fantasy authors need to grow a pair, well, other authors as well, but this is urban fantasy we're talking about. They need to grow a pair and include stories surrounding people of color and people of color characters. One that was great with the way that it interlaced people of color stories was Burn Down, Rise Up by Vincent Torrado. In this book, the horror-based magic in Brooklyn, New York was surrounded by the oppressive history of what Black people went through in the 1950s to 2000s. I'll bring up Blood to Poison again because the blood curse on Savannah, the main character, relates to family history and oppression as well, which coincidentally also happens to happen with Legendborn. A bit of a repetitive narrative and one that definitely needs to be said, but we need some fun ones in there as well for people of color. For the best urban fantasies out there, create stories for the people who live in those cities. Their histories, present experiences, and their futures. That's what makes them the different cultures that they're known for. Why haven't the stories of people of color living in cities been included more? Like, where's the Auckland-based urban fantasy, where children of a local iwi end up getting blessed by different gods and demigods from Maori mythology, and end up having to use that to sort of save the day or something? Can someone please write that for me? Furthermore, I think a lot more of the people of color focus for urban-based things has been put into historical fiction rather than fantasy fiction. Bring out more whimsical stuff, please. Making the city truly magical. It is disappointing how often that I find the cities that are being written don't link with the magical as much as I'd like to in urban fantasies. It feels like there's no significance to having the plot set in the present day and in this particular city. You can literally put the same story in a different city or a different world entirely, and you wouldn't have many changes to make. There was actually a comment that I saw on a video that I watched while researching for this video. This comment was on Reads with Rachel's channel, where she was talking about how much she was disappointed with urban fantasy, much like I have been before I found all the different material I found for a comeback. One commenter called Corby Day says this: I am a city planning student, and oftentimes I find that a lot of urban fantasy doesn't use the city setting to its fullest potential. There are so many little complexities to cities that could make interesting stories. And you can trust their opinion, because in that same comment they praise Unsleeping City, the best urban fantasy story to ever exist so far. Every urban fantasy that I've fallen in love with deliberately makes ways to tie the city and the magical together. Not just in specific locations, such as vampires only coming out of cities at night, but with the culture of the city as well. Brennan Lee Mulligan's craft of doing this for Unsleeping City, a Dimension 20 Dungeons & Dragons show, is largely due to him growing up for a lot of his life in New York City and traveling around it so much. There aren't just vampires in New York. They have a tight grip on the stock market and are based in Hell's Kitchen. They hold a lot of financial power within the city because they've been alive for so long and have been able to accrue a lot of wealth within that time. Historic dickhead Robert Moses is the main villain of this campaign, and he uses capitalism to become invincible as an undead Lich King. Credit is also due to the players in Unsleeping City who made characters with deep ties to the area, such as Siobhan Thompson's character. Her character is a Broadway diva who is actually a fairy. She uses the performances that she does and the cheers from the audience and the praise from performing arts to be able to gain magic and glamour and keep herself eternal and immortal. What Brennan did to New York was make it breathe magic, and that's something that not many urban fantasy stories do. Unsleeping City makes me, a Broadway kid, a theater kid, want to visit New York more than the actual Broadway shows there do. Unsleeping City does include magical elements of New York, but it somehow makes the more mundane elements and the less magical elements as well feel so magical. And yes, I may be making a video about Unsleeping City in the future because it is the best urban fantasy ever, and I cannot stop talking about it and should probably stop and save it for another video. I can only dream about making urban fantasies like many of the ones that I have listed today. Not all of them. Some of them I mentioned were shit. I know that if I want to write and read more urban fantasy stories, I'm going to be using all the points in this video to craft them. And if you have any urban fantasy stories that you feel brought your cities to life, please list them in the comments so I can read more. With that, I shall see you in another world.